Steel rails stretched across frost-bitten soil, past silent factories and watchtowers outlined in fog. On opposite ends of the map, light poured from windows where decisions were made behind locked doors, unseen but far-reaching. Children studied under portraits of different leaders. Radio signals hummed across borders, some carrying music, others warning. Silence became a tactic. The Cold War did not begin with an explosion. It settled in like weather, altering daily life without a clear arrival. Maps were redrawn not by warheads, but by whispers. Diplomats traded phrases like currency. Satellites tracked the movement of ships and shadows. Concrete lines split neighborhoods, while strangers disappeared behind slogans no one questioned aloud. The world adapted in small, uneasy increments. What followed would not depend on armies alone, but on how long opposing systems could hold their ground. Without touching, without turning back, 3 shadows fall across the marble floors of Levadia Palace as the most powerful men on earth gather to carve up a world still bleeding from its wounds. Outside, February winds whip the Black Sea into foam, while inside these gilded halls, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin bend over maps that will redraw the fate of continents. The year is 1945. Victory over Nazi Germany lies within reach. Yet the seeds of the next global conflict already take root in the fertile soil of competing ambitions. Roosevelt arrives bearing the strength of a nation that has transformed itself from reluctant isolationist into industrial titan. Its factories churning out weapons faster than enemies can destroy them. Its fleets patrolling oceans that no single power has ever controlled. Behind his confident demeanor and trademark cigarette holder lies a mind wrestling with the challenge of translating military triumph into lasting peace. The president who guided America through its darkest hours now faces decisions that will determine whether the victory his people purchased with blood serves freedom or tyranny. Across the negotiating table sits the man who commands more territory than any ruler since Genghis Khan swept across the steppes. Stalin controls armies stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, his divisions occupying lands that previous Russian czars could only dream of possessing. The Georgian revolutionary, who climbed to supreme power over the corpses of his rivals, now stands poised to secure gains that will reshape the map of Europe according to his iron will. Between them, Churchill embodies the cunning of an empire that has played the great game of international politics for centuries, his island nation's survival dependent upon American strength and Soviet sacrifice. Yet his strategic mind remains as sharp as the blade that once carved pink territories across the world's atlases. The bulldog who refused to yield when London burned under Nazi bombs brings to these negotiations a clear-eyed understanding of what lurks beneath diplomatic courtesies. Maps spread across polished mahogany reveal the magnitude of choices these 3 leaders must make. Germany lies prostrate, her cities reduced to smoking rubble, her vaunted armies fleeing toward a capital that burns like ancient Rome under barbarian assault. Yet the question that haunts every discussion cuts deeper than mere military occupation. Who will govern the peoples liberated from fascist rule? Each man arrives with visions that prove as incompatible as oil and water. The American delegation speaks of democracy spreading across liberated territories, like dawn breaking over a darkened landscape. Roosevelt's Atlantic Charter, proclaimed when victory seemed impossibly distant, promised all nations the right to choose their own governments through free elections that reflect popular will rather than conquerors' preferences. Now, with triumph within grasp, he faces the challenge of transforming noble ideals into practical arrangements that satisfy allies, whose definitions of liberty differ fundamentally from his own. Soviet responses emerge wrapped in revolutionary rhetoric about liberating workers from capitalist oppression. But the communist leader's true objectives shine through diplomatic language like steel through silk. His homeland has bled more than any other nation in this struggle. 20 million souls sacrificed on the altar of defeating fascism. The buffer zones he demands represent not territorial greed, but insurance against future invasions that could once again devastate lands from Leningrad to Stalingrad. The British Prime Minister recognizes the deadly game unfolding beneath cordial negotiations. His warnings about Soviet intentions fall upon American ears that prefer reassurance to alarm. Yet Churchill cannot ignore what his experienced eyes observe. The statesman who mobilized his nation's resolve against Nazi tyranny now watches helplessly as another form of dictatorship extends its shadow across territories that British blood helped liberate. Agreements reached at Yalta read like diplomatic triumph, but contain within them the genetic code of future conflict. The Georgian leader promises free elections in Poland, while his security forces arrest non-communist leaders who might actually win such contests. Roosevelt secures Soviet commitment to join the war against Japan, while accepting territorial arrangements that place millions of Europeans under Moscow's influence. The wartime Prime Minister wins guarantees for Western access to Berlin, while witnessing the Iron Curtain's descent across a continent he fought to free. Behind closed doors, where stenographers cannot record their private exchanges, the three leaders speak more honestly about expectations and fears. The American president believes personal relationships can bridge ideological chasms, that wartime cooperation will continue into peacetime despite fundamental differences in governing philosophy. His British counterpart harbors no such illusions about communist intentions, but lacks the military strength to impose alternative arrangements without full American backing. Meanwhile, their Soviet partner smiles and offers toasts while calculating how best to consolidate conquests that military success has placed within his iron grasp. As delegates depart Yalta for their respective capitals, each carries different interpretations of what was promised and what was agreed. Documents signed with ceremonial flourishes will be stretched to justify actions that serve national interests rather than Allied unity. The photographs of three men shaking hands before newsreel cameras mask tensions that will soon explode into confrontations, reshaping the entire international system. Within months, communist behavior in occupied territories reveals the gulf between Yalta's promises and Moscow's true intentions. Poland's government in exile, which fought beside Britain throughout the darkest years, finds itself excluded from power by authorities backed by Red Army bayonets. Romanian King Michael discovers his nation's sovereignty exists only at the communist leader's sufferance, while Bulgarian Democrats vanish into prisons that swallow political opposition without trace. Harry Truman inherits these mounting tensions when Roosevelt's death elevates the Missouri haberdasher to the presidency in April 1945. His first confrontations with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov crackle with barely contained hostility as the new president demands that Moscow honor its Yalta commitments. The foreign minister's protests about American interference in Soviet spheres meet blunt responses that signal fundamental changes in Washington's approach to the Kremlin. Potsdam Conference in July 1945 brings together leaders who no longer pretend their wartime alliance will survive peace. The American president arrives determined to demonstrate resolve, while his Soviet counterpart uses every opportunity to consolidate control over territories conquered by his armies. Churchill fights for political survival in British elections that will determine his nation's voice in shaping the post-war world, though Labour Party victory replaces him with Clement Attlee midway through negotiations. Discussions at Potsdam reveal irreconcilable differences about Germany's future that will define European politics for decades. American proposals for economic unity encounter Soviet demands for reparations that would strip their occupation zone of industrial capacity. British hopes for maintaining German strength as a bulwark against communist expansion conflict with French desires for permanent weakness in their traditional enemy. The resulting compromise satisfies no one while ensuring Germany's division becomes permanent. Communist control tightens across Eastern Europe as the war's end removes any pretense of inter-allied cooperation. Political parties that survived fascist persecution with Soviet support now emerge as dominant forces in coalition governments where non-communist partners face systematic marginalization. Secret police organizations modeled on the NKVD appear in capital after capital, their interrogation chambers echoing with the screams of Democrats who believed liberation would bring freedom rather than new forms of tyranny. Poland's transformation illustrates the pattern repeated throughout Soviet-occupied Europe. Leaders of the Home Army, who fought Nazi occupation with weapons dropped by British planes, find themselves arrested as Western spies by the same forces that promised to respect Polish independence. Elections held under communist supervision produce results that contradict every honest assessment of public opinion, while opposition figures disappear into gulags or unmarked graves. Czechoslovakia's fate proves even more dramatic as the nation that symbolized Western betrayal at Munich faces another abandonment by democratic allies. President Edvard Beneš returns from London exile, believing his country's strategic position will enable it to bridge East-West divisions. His hopes crumble as communist ministers use control of key ministries to eliminate opposition through methods that make Hitler's takeover seem subtle by comparison. Hungary's agony unfolds with equal inevitability as Soviet occupation forces oversee the gradual elimination of democratic institutions that briefly flourished after liberation from fascist rule. Coalition governments that initially included genuine representatives of various political parties gradually become communist monopolies, enforced by security forces answering to Moscow rather than Budapest. Cardinal Józef Mindszenty's arrest symbolizes the fate awaiting all institutions refusing to bow before imposed authority. In Berlin's ruins, where Hitler's bunker lies buried beneath rubble that was once the thousand-year Reich's capital, Allied occupation zones harden into permanent divisions, mirroring the broader split between former allies. American, British, and French sectors gradually merge into a single administrative unit, whose prosperity contrasts sharply with the Soviet zone, where reparations shipments to the Kremlin strip factories of equipment needed for recovery. The former Prime Minister's voice rises above diplomatic niceties, masking the growing confrontation between East and West. At Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, where President Truman sits beside him on the platform, Churchill delivers words that will define a generation's understanding of the new international reality. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, his voice booms across an audience, including the American leader who invited him to speak. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. His metaphor captures perfectly the barrier now dividing Europe between freedom and tyranny, between market economies and central planning, between governments deriving authority from popular consent and regimes maintaining power through fear. The speech transforms private diplomatic frustrations into public awareness of threats Soviet expansion poses to Western civilization, while the communist leader's angry response denouncing the former prime minister as a warmonger only confirms the accuracy of observations many hoped were exaggerated. Presidential response to Soviet expansion begins with commitments reshaping American foreign policy for generations. Crisis in Greece, where communist guerrillas threaten to overthrow a government supported by British bayonets, forces Washington to choose between abandoning allies and accepting global responsibilities previous American generations would have rejected. When Britain's financial exhaustion forces withdrawal of support for Greek Democrats, the United States faces its first test of resolve in the emerging confrontation. The Truman Doctrine, announced to a joint session of Congress in March 1947, commits America to supporting free peoples everywhere who resist subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Presidential words echo across a world where Soviet expansion threatens to engulf nation after nation unless checked by countervailing power. Greece and Turkey receive immediate aid, but established principles extend American protection to any government willing to resist communist expansion. Congressional debate over the doctrine reveals the magnitude of transformation. American foreign policy undergoes responding to Soviet threats. Republicans, who spent the previous decade opposing foreign entanglements, now support global commitments. Previous generations would have considered imperial overreach. Democrats, traditionally favoring international cooperation, must defend unilateral action against criticism that America seeks to replace British imperialism with its own version of global dominance. Economic confrontation accompanies diplomatic conflict as the United States unveils the Marshall Plan, that ambitious reconstruction program offering prosperity to all European nations willing to participate in cooperative recovery efforts. Secretary of State George Marshall's Harvard University announcement transforms American generosity into a weapon against Soviet influence, offering hope to populations that might otherwise turn to communism in desperation. The communist leader's rejection of Marshall Plan participation reveals his recognition that American aid carries conditions undermining Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Economic benefits reconstruction assistance offers pale beside political threats, accompanying Western influence in satellite states. His prohibition of Eastern European participation forces nations desperate for recovery aid to choose between American prosperity and Soviet protection. Communist coup in Czechoslovakia provides final proof that Moscow's ambitions extend beyond security concerns toward domination of all Europe within reach. February 1948. Events when armed communist militias seize Prague, while democratic leaders flee into exile or die under mysterious circumstances, shock Western opinion that hoped Czech democracy might survive in the Soviet sphere. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk's death, officially ruled suicide but widely believed murder, symbolizes the fate awaiting all who resist communist expansion. Hungary follows the Czech pattern as coalition government yields to single-party rule, enforced by security forces answering to Moscow rather than Budapest. Cardinal Mindszenty's arrest and trial demonstrates Soviet willingness to attack even the Catholic Church, pursuing total control over subject populations. Show trials producing confessions, obviously extracted through torture, reveal methods by which the communist empire maintains order among peoples who never chose such rule. Poland's transformation from liberation to subjugation illustrates cynical betrayal of promises about respecting small nations' rights. Government in exile that fought beside Britain throughout the struggle finds itself excluded from power by authorities taking orders from the Kremlin. Elections held under Soviet supervision produce results contradicting every honest assessment of public opinion, while opposition leaders face arrest as Western spies or fascist collaborators. As 1947 draws toward its close, Europe's division stands complete in all but name. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany has dissolved into hostile camps, separated by barriers growing stronger with each passing month. American aid flows westward, while Soviet influence spreads eastward, creating competing systems offering incompatible visions of human society. The stage stands set for confrontation that will dominate international politics for the next 4 decades. Roots of the Cold War run deep into soil of ideological differences. No amount of diplomatic cooperation could bridge permanently. Democracy and dictatorship, capitalism and communism, individual freedom and collective security. These competing values prove incompatible when transplanted from rhetoric into reality. The men who divided the world at Yalta perhaps understood their alliance served only the temporary purpose of defeating common enemies. What they may not have realized was the price their peoples would pay for victory purchased through compromise with tyranny. Dawn breaks over a city carved into pieces like a corpse on an anatomist's table. Berlin, that former capital of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, now stands divided among victors who have become enemies. Its streets patrolled by soldiers whose uniforms represent fundamentally incompatible visions of human freedom. Through the rubble-strewn avenues where Nazi jackboots once echoed, US jeeps and Red Army tanks now eye each other with barely concealed hostility across checkpoints that mark the new fault lines of global confrontation. On a cold March morning in 1948, Colonel Sergei Tulpanov receives orders that will transform Berlin from occupied city into battleground for the soul of Europe. The telegram from Moscow bears Stalin's personal seal, its coded message as clear as artillery fire. Cut off all land access to the western sectors, starve the capitalists into submission, and present the world with a fait accompli that no amount of democratic protest can reverse. What begins as a bureaucratic dispute over currency reform will escalate into the first great test of Western resolve in the emerging struggle. General Lucius Clay commands the US sector with the bearing of a man who understands that weakness invites aggression while strength preserves peace. When Soviet guards begin turning back supply trains at checkpoint after checkpoint along the autobahns leading into Berlin, he recognizes immediately that this represents more than administrative harassment. The Kremlin strategy aims to strangle West Berlin into surrender without firing a shot, demonstrating to the world that Washington's guarantees mean nothing when confronted by determined pressure from Moscow. Clay's urgent cables to the nation's capital paint the crisis in stark terms that demand immediate presidential attention. "We have lost Czechoslovakia," he writes to Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. "Norway is threatened. We retreat from Berlin. When Berlin falls, Western Germany will be next." His words echo through Pentagon corridors and White House briefing rooms, where officials grasp the magnitude of what hangs in the balance. Not merely the fate of 2 million Berliners, but the credibility of Western pledges throughout a world, watching to see if the United States will abandon its allies when tested. President Truman faces the most crucial decision of his presidency, as advisors debate options ranging from military convoy escorts that risk global conflict to diplomatic negotiations that might reward red aggression. The man from Missouri, who inherited the atomic bomb along with the Oval Office, understands that retreat from Berlin will signal to every threatened nation that protection from Washington offers no shelter against communist expansion. His response transforms a local crisis into a demonstration of Western determination that will inspire allies and warn enemies for generations to come. "We are going to stay, period," the president declares in a cabinet meeting where generals warn about Eastern military superiority in Europe and diplomats counsel caution to avoid nuclear confrontation. His decision to supply West Berlin by air, rather than armed convoy threads the needle between appeasement and global conflict, demonstrating resolve without providing Moscow with pretexts for retaliation. The Berlin airlift begins as an emergency measure, but evolves into an epic demonstration of what free nations can accomplish when united by common purpose. General William Turner organizes the most massive humanitarian airlift in history from headquarters that hum with activity 24 hours a day. Transport planes that once dropped paratroopers over Normandy now carry flour and coal to civilians whose only crime was living in the wrong sector of a divided city. Pilots who survived combat over Germany returned to German airspace as saviors rather than conquerors, their aircraft bringing hope instead of destruction to people who have learned to distinguish friends from enemies by the sound of approaching engines. Every 3 minutes, another cargo plane descends through Berlin's narrow air corridors, their pilots navigating by instruments through weather that would ground civilian flights while Red fighters patrol nearby airspace like wolves stalking wounded prey. Mathematical precision required to maintain this schedule strains human endurance and mechanical reliability to their limits. Yet day after day, month after month, the flights continue without pause. Each successful landing represents a small victory in a larger struggle for the future of European freedom. Berliners themselves transform from passive recipients of aid into active participants in their own survival, working alongside crews to unload cargoes that mean the difference between starvation and sufficiency. Children who scavenged for food among bomb craters now watch the skies for Rosenbomber, raisin bombers, whose crews drop candy on tiny parachutes, along with the serious business of keeping their city alive. These small gestures of humanity amid geopolitical confrontation demonstrate that the cold struggle remains a battle between peoples, not merely governments. Moscow's response to the airlift reveals the Kremlin's miscalculation of Western determination and capability. The blockade that was supposed to force capitulation within weeks, instead, provides daily evidence of technological superiority and humanitarian commitment from the democratic powers. Each successful flight carrying supplies to beleaguered Berliners broadcasts to the world that red pressure cannot break resolve when backed by superior organization and unlimited determination. As winter approaches and the airlift continues without interruption, Stalin faces the uncomfortable reality that his Berlin Gambit has strengthened rather than weakened Western solidarity. The blockade that was meant to demonstrate Eastern power instead reveals capabilities that astound both allies and enemies. More troubling still, the humanitarian nature of the Western response wins propaganda victories throughout Europe, while portraying actions from Moscow as cruel and vindictive. NATO's formation emerges directly from lessons learned during the Berlin crisis, as Western leaders recognize that scattered national forces cannot match red military advantages without formal alliance structures. Secretary of State Dean Acheson guides negotiations that bind 12 nations together in mutual defense agreements, their signatures on the Washington Treaty, creating the most powerful military alliance in human history. The ceremony itself takes place against the backdrop of continuing airlifts to Berlin, providing dramatic evidence of what collective security can accomplish. Harry Truman signs the NATO treaty in a White House ceremony, where the ghosts of Washington's farewell address seem to whisper warnings about foreign entanglements that previous generations would have heeded. Yet the president who once ran a haberdashery in Independence, Missouri, now commands global responsibilities that make isolationism as obsolete as cavalry charges. His signature commits the Republic to defend European allies as if they were states, revolutionizing foreign policy traditions that date to the nation's founding. General Dwight Eisenhower accepts command of NATO forces with the same methodical approach that carried Allied armies from Normandy to the Elbe. The man who planned D-Day now faces the challenge of welding diverse national armies into a unified force capable of deterring Red aggression while maintaining defensive postures that do not provoke the very confrontation they seek to prevent. His headquarters in France becomes the nerve center for Western military planning that must balance strength with restraint. Eastern reaction to NATO's formation follows predictably along lines that mirror Western alliance building, while serving different purposes entirely. The Warsaw Pact, established in 1955, binds satellite states together under Moscow's military command, though its true function involves legitimizing Red Army deployments rather than creating genuine collective defense arrangements. The contrast between voluntary NATO membership and imposed Warsaw Pact participation reveals fundamental differences between democratic and totalitarian approaches to international relations. Meanwhile, in laboratories and testing grounds thousands of miles from Berlin's divided streets, scientists work feverishly to unlock secrets that will reshape the balance of global power. On a remote peninsula in Kazakhstan, a device codenamed First Lightning transforms matter into energy with a flash that illuminates the dawn of nuclear parity. The mushroom cloud that rises over Semipalatinsk on August 29, 1949, signals the end of the atomic monopoly and the beginning of a new phase in cold competition. President Truman learns of the Red Atomic Test through intelligence reports that shatter assumptions about technological superiority, lasting for years, possibly decades. The news reaches the White House just as the Berlin airlift concludes in triumph, its success demonstrating Western capabilities, while Eastern atomic achievement proves that Marxist science can match innovation when focused on military objectives. The juxtaposition of these events, humanitarian victory and nuclear stalemate, defines the contradictions that will characterize the Cold Struggle for decades to come. Across the Pacific, where ancient civilizations witness the birth pangs of modern revolution, events unfold that will transform the cold confrontation from European crisis into global struggle. In the mountains and rice paddies of China, Mao Zedong's forces complete their victory over nationalist armies that aid from Washington could not save, despite billions in military assistance. The collapse of Chiang Kai-shek's government represents more than civil resolution. It signals the emergence of a red power with nearly a quarter of humanity under its control. Mao's triumph in China sends shockwaves through the capital, where officials struggle to comprehend how the world's most populous nation could fall to Marxism despite support for its government. Republican critics of the Truman administration seize upon the loss of China as evidence of democratic weakness in confronting global expansion of the Eastern Bloc, while defense planners recalculate strategic balances that now include a second major red power, with potential for projecting influence throughout Asia. Chinese victory creates new possibilities for strategy from Moscow, while presenting the Kremlin with potential challenges to its leadership of the world movement. Stalin's initial enthusiasm for Mao's success gradually gives way to concerns about Chinese independence and ambitions that might conflict with interests. The alliance between the two giants appears solid to Western observers, but contains within it seeds of future discord that will dramatically alter cold dynamics. Korean Peninsula becomes the testing ground where these new realities clash with explosive force. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces trained and equipped by advisors crash across the 38th parallel in a coordinated assault that catches South Korean defenders completely unprepared. Within days, armies advance towards Seoul, while officials debate whether this represents local aggression or the opening move in a global confrontation orchestrated from Moscow. President Truman's decision to intervene in Korea without congressional declaration establishes precedents that will govern military actions throughout the Cold Era. His commitment of ground forces to defend South Korea transforms a regional dispute into a test of containment doctrine, while his choice to act through United Nations authorization provides legal cover for military intervention without formal alliance obligations. The stakes could not be higher. Failure in Korea might encourage further Red aggression, while success demonstrates that Western forces can halt enemy advances when backed by sufficient determination. General Douglas MacArthur commands UN forces with the theatrical flair and strategic brilliance that made him a legend in the Pacific conflict. His audacious landing at Incheon transforms impending defeat into stunning victory, cutting North Korean supply lines while destroying enemy forces trapped in the south. The operation's success vindicates his reputation as a military genius, while setting the stage for strategic decisions that will ultimately cost him his command, and the United States its first clear victory in the Cold Struggle. Chinese intervention in Korea catches Western intelligence completely by surprise, despite warnings from commanders who observed massive troop buildups across the Yalu River. Hundreds of thousands of volunteers from Mao's People's Liberation Army pour into North Korea just as UN forces approach the Chinese border. Their human wave attacks overwhelming, technologically superior units, unprepared for Asian fighting methods that emphasize manpower over firepower. Resulting Chinese offensive drives UN forces back across the 38th parallel in the longest retreat in military history, shattering illusions about Western invincibility while demonstrating that Red powers will risk major confrontation to prevent threats to their vital interests. General Matthew Ridgway's assumption of field command stabilizes the military situation through tactical innovations adapted to Asian conditions. But strategic victory remains beyond reach as long as political limitations prevent attacks on Chinese territory. MacArthur's dismissal by President Truman crystallizes civilian military tensions inherent in fighting limited engagements for unlimited political objectives. The general who wanted to expand the struggle into China to achieve total victory finds himself relieved of command by a president who fears that wider conflict might trigger intervention from Moscow and nuclear escalation. The dramatic confrontation between two strong-willed leaders illustrates the challenges democratic societies face when military logic conflicts with political necessity. Armistice negotiations that eventually end active fighting in Korea demonstrate how cold conflicts resist traditional solutions based on decisive battlefield victory. The talks drag on for 2 years at Panmunjom, while soldiers die in trench combat that resembles world conflict more than the mobile operations that characterize the struggle's opening phases. The final agreement preserves the original division of Korea while establishing precedents for frozen disputes that will characterize cold geography. While forces fight and die in Korean mountains, domestic fears about infiltration reach fever pitch in congressional hearings that transform legitimate security concerns into political witch hunts. Senator Joseph McCarthy rises from obscurity to national prominence by claiming that State Department officials deliberately lost China through treasonous collaboration with enemy agents. His accusations, initially supported by limited evidence, gradually expand to encompass anyone whose loyalty he questions. McCarthyism unleashes forces that transform political culture in ways that outlast the senator's eventual downfall. Government employees face loyalty investigations that end careers based on association, rather than action, while Hollywood blacklists destroy lives of entertainers whose only crime involved attending meetings or supporting causes later deemed subversive. The paranoia that grips society reveals how external threats can undermine the very freedoms they purport to defend. President Truman's firing of General MacArthur provides McCarthy with ammunition to attack the administration's handling of the Korean engagement, while questioning the loyalty of officials who counseled restraint in fighting the Eastern Bloc. The senator's charges resonate with citizens frustrated by limited conflict's inconclusive results, though his methods increasingly alienate moderate politicians who support strong anti-red policies without embracing character assassination as political strategy. Congressional hearings, broadcast on television, bring McCarthy's tactics into living rooms where viewers witness his bullying behavior and unsubstantiated accusations firsthand. The medium that initially amplified his influence ultimately destroys his credibility as audiences observe the gap between his dramatic charges and factual evidence supporting them. His confrontation with Army Counsel Joseph Welch, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" marks the beginning of his political downfall. Stalin's death in March 1953 opens possibilities for changes in policy, while creating uncertainty about succession arrangements in a system built around personal dictatorship. The Georgian leader, who ruled through terror and paranoia for nearly 3 decades, leaves behind institutional structures designed to prevent any successor from accumulating similar power. The collective leadership that emerges must navigate between continuing his policies and reforming them without appearing to repudiate his legacy. Nikita Khrushchev emerges from succession struggles as first among equals in the post-Stalin hierarchy, his peasant cunning and political instincts enabling him to outmaneuver rivals who underestimate his capabilities. The Ukrainian leader, who survived purges by combination of loyalty and opportunism, now faces choices between continuing confrontational policies and exploring possibilities for peaceful coexistence with capitalist powers. His decisions will reshape foreign policy while creating opportunities for reducing cold tensions. The new leader's consolidation of power culminates in his famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress, where he denounces Stalin's crimes while carefully avoiding responsibility for his own complicity in them. The speech sends shockwaves throughout the Red World as local leaders struggle to understand how deeply they should criticize their former idol without undermining the legitimacy of the system he created. The revelations unleash forces for reform that will ultimately contribute to the Eastern system's eventual collapse. European responses to de-Stalinization vary dramatically as different satellite governments interpret Moscow's signals according to their own circumstances and population's expectations. Polish workers celebrate reforms that seem to promise greater autonomy, while Hungarian revolutionaries prepare to test whether promises of liberalization extend to accepting genuine independence from Kremlin control. The monolith that once appeared unshakable begins to reveal cracks that will widen under pressure. As 1955 draws toward its close, the cold confrontation has evolved from European crisis into global competition between superpowers commanding unprecedented destructive capabilities. The alliance systems that emerged from Berlin, crisis, and Korean conflict have hardened into permanent institutions designed to wage prolonged struggle without direct military confrontation. Nuclear weapons possessed by both sides create deterrent effects that paradoxically make limited disputes more likely, while raising stakes of any direct clash between the superpowers themselves. The world stands divided not merely by geography, but by competing ideologies that offer fundamentally incompatible visions of human progress and social organization. capitalism and socialism, democracy and dictatorship, individual freedom and collective security. These philosophical differences translated into political reality create tensions that no amount of diplomatic engagement can fully resolve. The stage is set for confrontations that will test both systems' ability to inspire loyalty while delivering prosperity to their respective populations. Yet even as military blocs confront each other across heavily defended borders, seeds of change germinate in the soil of seeming permanence. Stalin's death has unleashed forces for reform within the Eastern system, while McCarthyism's excesses have strengthened commitment to civil liberties. The nuclear balance that makes direct conflict unthinkable creates space for competition in other arenas: economic, technological, ideological, where victory depends more on achievement than destruction. The next phase of cold struggle will test these new realities, as leaders on both sides explore possibilities for coexistence, while maintaining readiness for confrontation should negotiations fail to resolve fundamental differences. In the streets of Budapest, where autumn leaves drift like ashes from a burned empire, students gather around the bronze statue of Stalin that has dominated Heroes Square since the dictator's death. Their voices rise in songs of freedom, while hammers and ropes work to topple the monument that symbolizes decades of foreign oppression. The year is 1956, the season of revolt has arrived, and across Eastern Europe, the promise of reform collides with the reality of power in explosions that will test the limits of both Soviet control and Western resolve. October 23rd brings revolution to the Hungarian capital, as university students march through cobblestone streets demanding freedom from Moscow's iron grip. Their procession swells with workers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens who have endured 11 years of puppet government, while watching their ancient nation disappear behind the facade of people's democracy. By evening, crowds storm the radio station to broadcast their demands across a country that holds its breath, wondering if the impossible moment of liberation has finally arrived. Nagy Imre assumes leadership of Hungary's rebellion with the reluctant dignity of a man thrust into history's spotlight. The former prime minister who once served Moscow faithfully now finds himself leading a revolution against his former masters, his scholarly demeanor masking the steel required to challenge the Kremlin's authority. His declaration of Hungarian neutrality and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact sends shockwaves through the communist world, while testing whether Khrushchev's promises of liberalization extend to accepting genuine independence. Soviet tanks roll into Budapest like iron thunderclouds on November 4th, their cannons answering students' rifles with the terrible logic of superior firepower. The T-54s that crushed Nazi resistance in the Great Patriotic War now turn their guns on freedom fighters, whose only crime was believing that self-determination meant more than empty rhetoric. Cardinal Mindszenty finds sanctuary in the United States Embassy, while Hungarian patriots die in the rubble of their dreams, their sacrifice witnessed by a world that offers sympathy but not salvation. Across the Atlantic, President Eisenhower faces the agonizing choice between principle and prudence, as Hungarian rebels broadcast desperate pleas for Western assistance. The general who liberated Europe from fascism now confronts the limits of American power when direct intervention risks nuclear confrontation. His decision to limit response to diplomatic protests and refugee assistance demonstrates the cruel mathematics of Cold War politics, where moral imperatives yield to strategic realities that no amount of righteous indignation can alter. Radio Free Europe's broadcasts into Hungary fuel hopes that prove tragically misplaced, their coded messages interpreted by desperate rebels as promises of military support that never materializes. The Hungarian Revolution dies in the crossfire between superpower calculations that treat small nations as pawns in games whose rules permit no genuine independence. The crushing of Budapest's uprising establishes precedents that will govern Soviet responses to future challenges within their sphere of influence. Meanwhile, in the secret chambers of the Kremlin, where Khrushchev consolidates power through political maneuvering that would impress Machiavelli himself, the Ukrainian peasant who rose to command the world's largest nation delivers his famous denunciation of Stalin's crimes. The secret speech to the 20th Party Congress unleashes forces for reform that will ultimately prove impossible to control. Its revelations about mass murder and systematic terror shocking delegates who participated in the very system they now learn to condemn. Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin's reign of terror spread through the communist world like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each wave carrying implications that threaten the foundations of established order. Party officials who built their careers serving a monster must now explain their complicity to populations that suddenly understand the scope of crimes committed in their name. The speech that was meant to consolidate the new leader's authority instead opens chasms between rulers and ruled that no amount of propaganda can bridge. Yet even as political earthquakes shake the foundations of communist authority, scientific achievements demonstrate the system's capacity for technological triumph that astounds the world. On October 4th, 1957, a metallic sphere weighing 184 pounds rises from the steppes of Kazakhstan on a column of flame that carries it beyond Earth's atmosphere into orbit around the planet. Sputnik's radio signals beeping across the heavens announce the dawn of the space age, while delivering a psychological shock to Western confidence that reverberates through every aspect of the Cold War competition. American reaction to Sputnik reveals the vulnerability that lurks beneath superpower confidence, as commentators struggle to explain how the Soviet Union achieved such a dramatic technological triumph. The beep, beep, beep of the satellite's radio transmitter becomes the soundtrack for national soul-searching about educational systems, military preparedness, and scientific priorities that suddenly seem inadequate compared to communist achievements. Newspapers that once mocked Soviet technology now warn of missile gaps that threaten American security. President Eisenhower's measured response to Sputnik reflects his military experience with the development of new weapons systems. Yet even his calming reassurances cannot entirely quiet fears that the United States has fallen behind in the race to master the high frontier of space. The creation of NASA and accelerated missile programs demonstrate American determination to reclaim technological leadership while competing in an arena where Cold War rivalries extend beyond terrestrial boundaries into the infinite cosmos. Soviet space triumphs multiply with metronomic precision that suggests systematic superiority over Western efforts, hampered by bureaucratic competition and divided resources. Luna 2's impact on the Moon delivers the hammer and sickle to celestial soil, while Luna 3's photographs of the Moon's far side reveal landscapes that no human eye has ever witnessed. Each achievement builds momentum toward the ultimate prize that will demonstrate which system can best organize human knowledge and determination. Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight on April 12, 1961, crowns Soviet space achievements with a triumph that captures imaginations throughout the world, while delivering another stunning blow to American prestige. The young pilot who circles the Earth in 108 minutes becomes an instant global hero, his boyish grin and humble demeanor embodying the promise of communist society to create new forms of human greatness. His flight demonstrates capabilities that Western intelligence agencies never suspected, while proving that the correlation of forces in the Cold War extends far beyond traditional measures of military strength. American response to Gagarin's flight culminates in President Kennedy's dramatic commitment to land astronauts on the moon before the decade's end, a pledge that transforms the space race from symbolic competition into a test of national will and technological capability. The young president who campaigned on promises to get the country moving again stakes his administration's prestige on achieving a goal that requires mobilizing resources on a scale comparable to the Manhattan Project or World War II industrial mobilization. While rockets pierce the sky carrying the dreams and fears of earthbound humanity, more immediate crises test the resolve of leaders who must navigate between aggression and accommodation without triggering the nuclear catastrophe that haunts every strategic calculation. The U-2 incident of May 1960 demonstrates how technological espionage can escalate into diplomatic disaster when France's Gary Powers' high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft falls victim to a Soviet surface-to-air missile over Sverdlovsk. Powers' capture provides Khrushchev with propaganda ammunition to attack American perfidy while derailing the Paris summit that might have reduced Cold War tensions through negotiated agreements. The pilot's confession and the wreckage of his aircraft offer irrefutable proof of American spying operations that Washington initially denies but must eventually acknowledge. President Eisenhower's acceptance of responsibility for the flights demonstrates personal integrity while providing his successor with a legacy of heightened tensions. The failed summit meeting in Paris reveals how quickly diplomatic progress can dissolve when confronted by the realities of intelligence gathering and national security requirements that both superpowers consider essential for their survival. Khrushchev's theatrical denunciations of American espionage mask his own recognition that both sides engage in similar activities. Yet the political dynamics of the moment require dramatic gestures that preclude rational discussion of mutual interests. Cuban Revolution adds a new dimension to Cold War calculations, as Fidel Castro's guerrilla forces triumph over Batista's dictatorship through mountain warfare that demonstrates how determined insurgents can defeat conventional armies backed by superpower patronage. The bearded revolutionary who enters Havana in January 1959 initially appears to offer possibilities for democratic governance in the Caribbean, yet his rapid embrace of communist ideology transforms the island into a Soviet outpost 90 miles from American shores. Castro's political evolution from nationalist rebel to Marxist revolutionary reflects both ideological conviction and strategic calculation as he navigates between American hostility and Soviet support. The Cuban leader's fiery denunciations of Yankee imperialism resonate throughout Latin America, while his land reforms and literacy campaigns demonstrate communist capabilities for social transformation. His alliance with Moscow provides protection against American retaliation, while extending Soviet influence into the Western Hemisphere for the first time in the Cold War. CIA planning for Castro's overthrow begins almost immediately after his victory, as intelligence analysts recognize the strategic threat posed by a communist government in America's backyard. The agency that helped overthrow governments in Iran and Guatemala now prepares its most ambitious operation, training Cuban exiles for an invasion designed to trigger popular uprising against revolutionary rule. Operation Mongoose and related programs demonstrate American determination to roll back communist gains in the Western Hemisphere. Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 transforms CIA planning into operational disaster as the exile brigade trained in Guatemala encounters fierce resistance from Castro's forces, while promised American air support fails to materialize. President Kennedy's last-minute decision to cancel airstrikes leaves the invaders exposed on the beaches, while Cuban forces, supported by Soviet advisors, systematically destroy their hopes of establishing beachheads for further operations. The invasion's failure strengthens Castro's position while providing him with justification for deeper alliance with Moscow and systematic persecution of internal opposition. Cuban revolutionaries who might have opposed communist dictatorship find themselves defending their nation against foreign invasion, their patriotism overriding ideological differences in the face of external threat. The fiasco damages American prestige throughout Latin America, while demonstrating the limits of covert action when unsupported by genuine popular uprising. Kennedy's acceptance of responsibility for the Bay of Pigs debacle establishes his credentials for personal integrity while leaving him vulnerable to charges of inexperience in confronting communist expansion. The young president, who campaigned on promises to be tougher than his predecessor, now faces the reality that good intentions cannot substitute for effective policy in dealing with determined adversaries. His administration's learning curve in foreign affairs will be tested repeatedly as crises multiply throughout his brief tenure. Berlin emerges once again as the focal point for Cold War tensions, as thousands of East Germans flee daily through the city's unguarded border, their exodus providing visible proof of communist system failure while draining the satellite state of its most productive citizens. Khrushchev's threats to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany and end Western access to Berlin create a crisis atmosphere that tests both superpowers' willingness to risk war over principles neither side can abandon without losing credibility. Construction of the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961, provides a crude but effective solution to the refugee crisis, while symbolizing the fundamental bankruptcy of communist appeals to human loyalty. The barrier that divides families and imprisons populations becomes the most visible symbol of Cold War division, its concrete blocks and barbed wire proclaiming to the world that communist regimes must cage their people to prevent escape to freedom. President Kennedy's response to the wall's construction balances outrage with realism as he reinforces the American garrison in Berlin while avoiding military actions that might escalate local crisis into global conflict. His dramatic visit to West Berlin and famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech demonstrate American commitment to the city's freedom, while providing moral support to populations trapped behind communist barriers. The wall's construction marks a turning point in Cold War dynamics, as both sides accept the division of Europe while seeking advantages in other theaters where the competition might produce different results. German reunification disappears from active diplomatic agendas as the reality of permanent division becomes embedded in alliance structures and strategic planning. The concrete barrier becomes a monument to the failure of negotiations to resolve fundamental ideological differences through compromise. Soviet missile deployment in Cuba during 1962 represents the most dangerous moment in human history, as nuclear weapons come within minutes of destroying civilization in a crisis that tests leadership under pressure, unlike any previous international confrontation. Khrushchev's decision to secretly install medium-range ballistic missiles on the Caribbean island reflects both strategic calculation and personal psychology, as he seeks to redress perceived American advantages while protecting his Cuban ally from future invasion attempts. American reconnaissance flights over Cuba reveal the missile sites before they become operational, providing President Kennedy with photographic evidence that transforms suspicions into certainty while creating an urgent deadline for action before the weapons achieve the capacity to strike American cities. The U-2 photographs that show Soviet missiles under construction become some of the most important intelligence documents in history, their stark black and white imagery revealing the machinery of potential apocalypse. XCOM deliberations in the White House bring together the finest strategic minds in American government as they debate options ranging from surgical airstrikes to full-scale invasion, while the clock ticks toward a deadline that no one can precisely calculate. The recorded conversations reveal the agonizing choices facing democratic leaders when military logic conflicts with political wisdom and human survival hangs in the balance of decisions that must be made under extreme pressure. Robert Kennedy's secret negotiations with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin provide the diplomatic channel through which the superpowers step back from the nuclear brink, while saving face for both leaders who have staked their prestige on incompatible positions. The Attorney General's meetings with the ambassador demonstrate how personal relationships and informal diplomacy can succeed where formal negotiations might fail when the stakes reach existential levels. Naval quarantine of Cuba represents a compromise between military action and diplomatic protest that allows both sides to test resolve while maintaining options for escalation or de-escalation depending on the other's response. American warships intercept Soviet vessels carrying missile equipment while carefully avoiding actions that might be interpreted as acts of war, their delicate maneuvering reflecting the complexity of nuclear-age confrontation. Soviet decision to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American pledges not to invade the island and secret withdrawal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey demonstrates Khrushchev's recognition that nuclear war offers no rational outcome for any participant. The Soviet leader's climb down from confrontation preserves peace while costing him political capital that contributes to his eventual removal from power by colleagues who consider his crisis management dangerously reckless. The 13 days that bring humanity to the edge of nuclear extinction and back again reveal both the fragility of peace and the capacity of responsible leadership to find alternatives to catastrophe when faced with ultimate choices. The crisis establishes precedents for superpower communication and crisis management that will help prevent similar confrontations from reaching the same dangerous levels in future decades. Resolution of the missile crisis ushers in a period of cautious cooperation as both superpowers recognize their shared interest in avoiding nuclear destruction while continuing their competition in less dangerous arenas. The hotline established between Washington and Moscow provides direct communication channels that bypass the delays and misunderstandings that can escalate minor incidents into major confrontations when time is measured in minutes rather than days. Nuclear test ban treaty negotiations begin almost immediately after the Cuban crisis, as both leaders seek to reduce tensions while maintaining their commitment to competition in other spheres. The limited treaty that emerges from these discussions prohibits atmospheric testing while allowing continued underground development of nuclear weapons, a compromise that addresses public health concerns while permitting continued technological advancement. As 1962 draws to a close, the Cold War has reached a new level of maturity as both superpowers recognize the absolute necessity of avoiding direct military confrontation while pursuing their rivalry through proxy conflicts, economic competition, and ideological struggle. The lessons learned from Cuba will shape strategic thinking for decades to come, as leaders on both sides understand that nuclear weapons have fundamentally altered the calculations of international relations. The world that emerges from the missile crisis is both more dangerous and more stable than the one that entered it, as the reality of mutual destruction creates incentives for restraint, while the continuing ideological competition ensures that tensions will persist in new forms. The next phase of the Cold War will test whether the wisdom gained from nuclear brinkmanship can prevent future crises from reaching similar levels of danger, while the underlying competition continues to shape global politics. A red telephone sits silent on President Kennedy's desk in the White House, its direct line to the Kremlin representing humanity's narrow escape from nuclear annihilation just months before. The hotline that emerged from the Cuban Missile Crisis symbolizes a new reality in superpower relations. Enemies who must learn to communicate if they wish to survive their own weapons. Outside the Oval Office windows, Washington's cherry blossoms bloom in the spring of 1963, their delicate beauty a reminder that life persists even as the machinery of mutual destruction grows ever more sophisticated. Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed in Moscow during August 1963, marks the first concrete step away from the atomic brink that nearly claimed civilization itself. Secretary of State Dean Rusk joins his British and Russian counterparts in ceremonies that ban atmospheric testing, while preserving each nation's right to develop weapons underground. The compromise satisfies no one completely, yet represents progress towards sanity in an age when radioactive fallout threatens the genetic inheritance of unborn generations. Kennedy's speech at the university in June 1963 signals a fundamental shift in thinking about the nature of cold confrontation. As the president who faced down missiles in Cuba now calls for re-examining attitudes toward peace itself, his words echo across a world still trembling from atomic confrontation. We must deal with the world as it is, not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. The address marks the beginning of détente, thinking that will reshape superpower relations for the next decade. Yet even as diplomats explore possibilities for reducing tensions between the superpowers, proxy conflicts multiply across the developing world, where the cold struggle finds new battlegrounds among peoples emerging from colonial rule. In the rice paddies and jungle highlands of Southeast Asia, a regional dispute transforms into the defining battle of a generation as Washington commits prestige to preventing red victory in Vietnam. President Johnson inherits the Vietnam commitment along with Kennedy's advisors, their confident assurances about limited engagement proving as misguided as their assumptions about easy victory. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 provides the pretext for escalation that transforms a small-scale advisory mission into a full-scale confrontation that will consume resources and morale for the next decade. Congressional resolution passes with only 2 dissenting votes, granting presidential authority to wage undeclared combat on the other side of the world. Ho Chi Minh commands North Vietnamese resistance with the patience of a revolutionary who has fought French colonialism, Japanese occupation, and now faces the full might of the world's most powerful military machine. The aging leader who proclaimed independence in Hanoi, using words borrowed from the Declaration of Independence, now marshals his people for a struggle that will test their endurance against firepower, exceeding anything previously unleashed in human history. General William Westmoreland requests ever larger numbers of troops as his strategy of attrition encounters an enemy that refuses to cooperate by accepting defeat when casualty ratios suggest they should surrender. The architect of military strategy in Vietnam believes that superior technology and unlimited resources can overcome revolutionary determination and knowledge of local terrain. Yet each escalation produces demands for further increases in commitment. Rolling thunder bombing campaigns unleash tonnages of explosives that dwarf anything dropped during world combat. Yet North Vietnamese supply lines continue functioning through ingenuity and determination that planners never anticipated. The Ho Chi Minh Trail becomes a network of paths and tunnels that channels weapons and supplies southward despite constant aerial bombardment. Its resilience demonstrating how motivated populations can adapt to technological engagement. Casualties mount steadily as ground combat reveals the limitations of conventional tactics against guerrilla fighters who choose their battles while avoiding decisive engagement. Body counts that measure progress in Pentagon briefings mask a reality where territorial control remains fluid and enemy strength regenerates despite massive losses. Television coverage brings battlefield images into living rooms where citizens witness their sons dying in jungles whose strategic importance remains unclear. Student protests that begin on university campuses evolve into a broader anti-war movement that challenges not merely policy decisions, but fundamental assumptions about righteousness in global affairs. The generation that inherited victory over fascism and prosperity beyond previous imagination now questions whether their government's actions abroad serve freedom or imperialism, democracy or domination. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of Eurasia, fractures appear in the red monolith as ideological disputes between Moscow and Beijing escalate into border clashes that threaten to explode into full-scale confrontation between the world's largest socialist nations. The Sino-Soviet split represents the most significant development in cold dynamics since the alliance system's formation, as unity of the Marxist world dissolves into competing claims for revolutionary legitimacy. Mao Zedong challenges Khrushchev's leadership of the international movement through denunciations of revisionism that mask deeper conflicts over national interests and strategic priorities. The Chinese leader who achieved victory through peasant revolution rejects models of gradual reform in favor of radical transformation that culminates in the Cultural Revolution's chaotic assault on traditional authority. His split with Moscow opens possibilities for triangular diplomacy that will reshape global politics. Border fighting along the Ussuri River brings Chinese and Red Army forces into direct combat for the first time since their alliance's formation, their clashes demonstrating how quickly ideological disputes can escalate into military confrontation. Battles that rage over contested islands reveal the depth of antagonism between powers that Western intelligence assumed would remain united by shared doctrine and common enemies. Atomic threats exchanged between Beijing and Moscow alarm Western observers who recognize that nuclear combat between socialist powers could trigger global catastrophe regardless of whether capitalist nations participate. The prospect of mushroom clouds rising over Asian battlefields forces strategic planners to reconsider assumptions about alliance structures and deterrent relationships in a world where enemies might destroy each other without Western involvement. Civil rights struggles within the United States provide propaganda ammunition to attack claims of moral leadership, while internal dissent weakens national unity needed for sustained international engagement. Images of police dogs attacking peaceful protesters in Birmingham and federal troops protecting black students entering previously segregated schools contradict rhetoric about freedom and democracy abroad. Johnson's Great Society programs compete with Vietnam's spending for resources, while his domestic agenda suffers from the unpopularity of foreign entanglements that seem to produce casualties without victories. Liberal coalitions that might have supported ambitious social reforms fracture over disagreements about priorities and methods, their energy dissipated by conflicts that divide natural allies. Assassinations that claim John Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy within 5 years traumatized society while suggesting to foreign observers that the United States faces internal breakdown comparable to revolutionary upheavals in developing nations. Violence that strikes down leaders who embodied hope for peaceful change creates cynicism about democratic processes that will persist for generations. European developments reflect the continent's gradual recovery of strategic autonomy, as economic prosperity enables more independent policies toward both superpowers. Charles de Gaulle's withdrawal of France from NATO's integrated command structure challenges leadership of the Western Alliance, while his pursuit of détente with Moscow demonstrates possibilities for reducing tensions through bilateral diplomacy rather than bloc confrontation. West German Ostpolitik under Willy Brandt attempts to normalize relations with Eastern neighbors through economic cooperation and diplomatic recognition that accepts post-war realities while maintaining hopes for eventual reunification. Policies that acknowledge East Germany's existence as a separate state outrage conservative politicians who consider such recognition a betrayal of unification goals. Yet practical benefits gradually overcome ideological objections. Prague Spring of 1968 tests willingness to permit genuine reform within the Eastern sphere of influence as Alexander Dubček's government attempts to create socialism with a human face. Through liberalization that stops short of abandoning Marxist rule, the Czechoslovak experiment combines economic decentralization with political freedom in ways that suggest possibilities for evolutionary change within existing systems. Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia on August 20th, 1968, demonstrates Moscow's determination to prevent reforms that might inspire similar demands throughout Eastern Europe. The crushing of Prague Spring by tanks from 5 socialist nations establishes the Brezhnev doctrine that justifies intervention whenever Red rule faces internal challenges. Its principles ensuring that satellite states remain subordinate to interests regardless of their population's preferences. Leonid Brezhnev's consolidation of power after Khrushchev's removal brings stability to leadership while freezing reform initiatives that might have adapted the system to changing conditions. The Ukrainian leader, who rose through party apparatus rather than revolutionary struggle, embodies the bureaucratic mentality that values order over innovation. His long tenure marking an era of stagnation that will ultimately contribute to the system's collapse. Nixon's election in 1968 brings to the White House a president whose foreign policy experience and strategic vision enable fundamental shifts in approaches to cold competition. The former vice president, who once debated Khrushchev in a Moscow kitchen, now commands resources to implement triangular diplomacy that exploits Sino-Soviet tensions while reducing commitments that exceed national capabilities. Henry Kissinger's appointment as National Security Advisor provides Nixon with an intellectual partner whose academic background in European diplomacy complements presidential instincts for realpolitik that transcends ideological considerations. The Harvard professor who studied Metternich and Bismarck now applies lessons from 19th century statecraft to 20th century problems that require balancing power rather than pursuing absolute victory. Opening to China begins with secret negotiations that demonstrate how diplomatic creativity can overcome decades of mutual hostility when strategic interests align. The ping-pong diplomacy that captures public imagination masks serious discussions about mutual security concerns and shared opposition to expansion that threatens both Chinese and Western interests in different regions. Nixon's journey to Beijing in February 1972 transforms global politics through personal diplomacy that demonstrates how individual leadership can reshape international systems when circumstances permit bold initiatives. The president who built his career on anti-communist rhetoric now shakes hands with Mao Zedong, while television cameras broadcast images that shatter assumptions about permanent enmity between ideological opponents. SALT negotiations with Moscow proceed simultaneously with Chinese opening, as Nixon demonstrates ability to negotiate with both powers while playing them against each other. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that emerges from lengthy discussions establishes parity in certain categories of atomic weapons, while permitting continued modernization that maintains the arms race at more predictable levels. Moscow Summit of May 1972 provides Brezhnev with opportunities to demonstrate his own statesmanship, while signing agreements that reduce tensions without resolving fundamental disagreements about spheres of influence and acceptable behavior in international relations. Ceremonies in the Kremlin represent the high point of détente, as leaders who command humanity's fate pledge to reduce risks of atomic confrontation. Yom Kippur fighting of October 1973 demonstrates how regional conflicts can escalate into superpower confrontations, despite détente agreements and direct communication channels. Egypt's surprise attack on Israeli positions triggers military assistance that prompts threats to intervene directly, their atomic forces placed on high alert as crisis escalates toward levels not seen since Cuba. Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy between Middle Eastern capitals prevents wider engagement while establishing dominance in regional peace processes that exclude significant roles for Moscow. The Secretary of State, who orchestrated opening to China, now demonstrates how superpower competition continues even during periods of ostensible cooperation, with each side seeking advantages that serve national interests rather than mutual accommodation. Oil embargo imposed by Arab producers in response to support for Israel transforms global economics while providing new weapons for nations that lack military strength to challenge superpowers directly. The quadrupling of petroleum prices creates economic chaos throughout the developed world, while demonstrating how resource diplomacy can shift power relationships that seemed permanent. Helsinki Accords of 1975 represent the climax of détente process, as 35 nations sign agreements that recognize post-war European boundaries, while promising respect for human rights that governments routinely violate. The final act signed in Finland's capital appears to legitimize control over Eastern Europe, while creating legal foundations for dissent movements that will ultimately undermine authority. Vietnamese Red Victory in April 1975 provides Moscow with strategic gains while demonstrating the limits of power when applied to conflicts that lack clear objectives or popular support. Helicopters evacuating personnel from Saigon embassy rooftops broadcast images of defeat that shatter assumptions about invincibility while encouraging revolutionary movements throughout the developing world. Watergate's scandal destroys Nixon's presidency while weakening capacity for sustained international engagement during crucial years when détente faces mounting challenges. Constitutional crisis that forces presidential resignation demonstrates democratic resilience while providing adversaries with evidence of internal dysfunction that they exploit in propaganda and diplomacy. Gerald Ford inherits a weakened presidency at the moment when credibility suffers from military defeat, economic stagflation, and political scandal that combine to create the most serious crisis of confidence since the Great Depression. The unelected president who assumed office through constitutional succession must restore national morale while managing international relationships damaged by domestic turmoil. As 1975 concludes, détente has achieved mixed results in reducing cold tensions, while failing to resolve fundamental conflicts that divide the superpowers. Agreements signed with great ceremony prove fragile when tested by regional crises that engage vital interests. Neither side can abandon without appearing weak. Atomic parity creates stability at the strategic level, while conventional competition intensifies throughout the developing world. This period demonstrates both possibilities and limitations of coexistence between incompatible systems that share common interests in survival while pursuing conflicting goals for global organization. The next phase will test whether foundations laid during détente can survive mounting pressures that threaten to destroy the fragile progress achieved at such great cost in blood and treasure. Darkness descends over the Hindu Kush mountains as transport planes drone through the thin air above Afghanistan. Their cargo holds filled with paratroopers whose mission will transform a regional conflict into the graveyard of détente. Christmas Eve, 1979, witnesses the beginning of an occupation that will drain the Kremlin's resources, while providing the West with opportunities to bleed Moscow through proxies who fight with the fury of religious zealots defending their homeland. The invasion that appears to demonstrate strength will ultimately reveal the fatal overextension of an empire already straining under burdens it can no longer bear. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev authorizes the intervention with the confidence of a leader who has presided over 2 decades of apparent stability and gradual expansion of influence. The Ukrainian bureaucrat who rose through party ranks during Stalin's purges now commands the world's largest military machine, yet his decision to invade Afghanistan reflects the sclerotic thinking of a gerontocracy that mistakes tactical success for strategic wisdom. His Politburo colleagues nod approval for an operation they expect to conclude within weeks, their calculations as flawed as their understanding of the energies they are about to unleash. Red Army units pour across the Oxus River like a mechanical tide, their tanks and armored personnel carriers designed for European battlefields, struggling with mountain passes and desert terrain that favor defenders over invaders. The 40th Army that conquered Berlin and crushed Hungarian Revolution now faces an enemy that melts away before superior firepower, only to reappear where least expected. Their hit-and-run tactics perfected through centuries of resisting foreign conquest. Afghan Mujahideen respond to the invasion with the same ferocity their ancestors displayed against British imperial troops in the previous century. Their knowledge of local terrain and tribal loyalties, providing advantages that no amount of modern technology can overcome. Commanders like Ahmad Shah Massoud transform peasant fighters into guerrilla units capable of ambushing supply convoys and besieging isolated outposts. Their tactics adapted from successful resistance movements that expelled previous occupiers. President Jimmy Carter learns of the invasion through emergency briefings that shatter his assumptions about détente and peaceful coexistence between the superpowers. The Georgia peanut farmer, who entered the White House promising human rights diplomacy, now faces the harsh reality that moral leadership requires military backing when confronting enemies who respect only strength. His response will define the final phase of the Cold Struggle, as both superpowers abandon restraint in pursuit of ultimate victory. Carter Doctrine, proclaimed in January 1980, commits the United States to defending the Persian Gulf against any external threat, transforming a regional oil supply into a vital national interest worthy of military intervention. Presidential words echo through Pentagon corridors, where planners begin preparing for conflicts that might require deploying personnel halfway around the world to protect resources essential for Western prosperity. CIA operations in support of Afghan resistance begin cautiously with limited supplies of obsolete weapons, yet gradually escalate into the most expensive covert action in the agency's history. Director William Casey orchestrates a program that channels billions in aid through Pakistani intelligence services, while maintaining plausible deniability about direct involvement in fighting that could escalate into superpower confrontation. Charlie Wilson, the flamboyant Texas congressman whose personal crusade transforms congressional appropriations into instruments of geopolitical strategy, becomes the unlikely architect of Moscow's defeat. His ability to secure funding for increasingly sophisticated weapons demonstrates how individual determination can shape the course of global conflicts when combined with institutional leverage and strategic vision. Stinger missiles provided by the CIA revolutionized the Afghan conflict by neutralizing air superiority that the Kremlin had considered decisive. The shoulder-fired weapons that bring down helicopter gunships and transport aircraft level the playing field between superpower technology and guerrilla determination, their success proving that advanced weaponry can shift the balance of asymmetric warfare when deployed by motivated fighters. Olympic boycotts transform athletic competition into political theater, as both superpowers use international sporting events to demonstrate opposition to each other's policies. The Moscow Games of 1980 proceed without Western participation, while Los Angeles hosts a diminished competition 4 years later, their reduced scope symbolizing how cold rivalry poisons even supposedly apolitical endeavors designed to promote international understanding. NATO's decision to deploy Pershing II and cruise missiles in Europe triggers the largest peace demonstrations since Vietnam, as millions march through capitals demanding nuclear disarmament, while governments insist that military strength provides the only guarantee of security. Protests that fill streets from London to Bonn reveal growing public anxiety about atomic weapons, while strengthening propaganda campaigns against Western militarism. Walkout from arms control negotiations demonstrates how quickly diplomatic progress can dissolve when confronted by technological developments that upset established balances. The intermediate-range missiles that NATO deploys in response to earlier deployments create launch-on-warning scenarios that compress decision times to minutes, while increasing possibilities for accidental conflict triggered by mechanical failure or human error. Ronald Reagan enters the presidency in January 1981 with a mandate to restore strength after the perceived weakness of the Carter years, his Hollywood background providing skills in communication that enable him to sell military build-up to audiences weary from decades of taxation and foreign commitments. The former actor who starred in B-grade movies now commands the world's most powerful military, while promising to rebuild capabilities that will intimidate enemies and reassure allies. His evil empire speech crystallizes the administration's approach to Moscow in language that abandons diplomatic niceties for moral clarity that defines the conflict in religious terms. Presidential words delivered to evangelical Christians echo through the Kremlin, where aging leaders struggle to understand how their revolution that promised human liberation has become synonymous with oppression in Western eyes. Strategic Defense Initiative, announced in March 1983, proposes defending against ballistic missiles through space-based weapons that violate existing treaties, while promising security that previous generations could only dream of achieving. The Star Wars program that captures public imagination also terrifies planners who recognize their inability to compete in high-technology arms races that require economic resources they lack. Technical intelligence services work frantically to steal Western computer technology, while their economy struggles to produce consumer goods that match quality standards achieved by capitalist competitors decades earlier. The gap between military capabilities and civilian prosperity grows wider with each passing year, as defense spending consumes resources needed for infrastructure and social programs. Solidarity movement in Poland demonstrates how economic crisis can undermine political control when combined with organized opposition that challenges the legitimacy of imposed rule. Lech Wałęsa's shipyard workers create the first independent trade union in the Eastern Bloc, while demanding rights that threaten the foundations of the system itself, their success inspiring similar movements throughout the region. General Wojciech Jaruzelski's declaration of martial law in December 1981 prevents intervention by crushing solidarity through Polish units rather than Warsaw Pact armies. His action demonstrating how satellite leaders must choose between domestic opposition and foreign occupation. The crackdown that drives resistance underground also reveals the fragility of Red control when confronted by popular movements that refuse to accept imposed authority. Korean Airlines Flight 007 shot down by interceptors in September 1983 provides the administration with propaganda victory that illustrates the moral bankruptcy of a system that murders innocent civilians to protect military secrets. The airliner that strayed into restricted airspace becomes a symbol of brutality while demonstrating the hair-trigger tensions that could escalate minor incidents into major confrontations. Able Archer 83 exercises nearly trigger nuclear conflict when intelligence interprets NATO maneuvers as cover for actual first strike preparations. Their paranoia, reflecting genuine fears that rhetoric might translate into preventive actions designed to eliminate the Red threat while Western superiority remains decisive. The scare that grips Moscow during November 1983 reveals how close the world comes to destruction through miscalculation and misunderstanding. Economic stagnation deepens throughout the Eastern Bloc as command economies prove incapable of adapting to technological revolutions that transform Western societies through computer networks and advanced manufacturing techniques. The productivity gaps that emerge during the 1980s create disparities in living standards that make promises of eventual prosperity appear increasingly hollow to populations that witness capitalist success through improved communications. Latin American conflicts multiply as both superpowers support proxies in struggles that transform the Western Hemisphere into another cold battleground where ideological competition produces humanitarian disasters. Nicaragua's Sandinista revolution receives backing, while the administration supports Contra rebels through operations that circumvent congressional restrictions and ultimately produce constitutional crises. Iran-Contra scandal reveals how cold logic can corrupt democratic institutions when officials believe that necessity justifies illegal methods in pursuit of strategic objectives. Revelations that emerged during 1987 hearings demonstrate how covert operations designed to fight Marxism can undermine the very freedoms they purport to defend, their exposure weakening credibility while strengthening congressional oversight. Mikhail Gorbachev's selection as General Secretary in March 1985 represents the victory of reform elements within the Kremlin, who recognize that existing policies lead inevitably toward economic collapse and political irrelevance. The youngest leader since Stalin brings energy and vision to an office that has been occupied by invalids and ideologues whose failure to adapt has brought the system to the brink of collapse. Initial Western reactions to his appointment reflect skepticism based on decades of experience with leaders who promise changes while maintaining essential features of authoritarian rule. Intelligence analysts who examine his background find evidence of pragmatic thinking, yet remain uncertain whether his reform initiatives represent tactical adjustments or fundamental departures from established policies that have governed East-West relations for 4 decades. Arms control initiatives that emerge from Geneva summit meetings demonstrate his recognition that military competition drains resources needed for domestic reconstruction while providing no strategic advantages that justify their enormous costs. His proposals for eliminating entire categories of weapons encounter initial resistance from Western officials who suspect offers that seem too good to be true, yet gradually gain credibility through consistent follow-through. economic reforms announced under the banner of perestroika acknowledge systemic failures that previous leaders denied, while promising restructuring that will unleash productive energies constrained by bureaucratic controls. The admission that central planning has failed represents ideological heresy that undermines the theoretical foundations of rule, while creating expectations for improvements that prove difficult to deliver. Glasnost policies that permit open discussion of previously forbidden topics unleash criticism of past errors, while revealing the scope of problems that decades of censorship had hidden from public view. The transparency that he encourages strengthens his position against conservative opponents, while eroding public confidence in institutions whose legitimacy depended upon maintaining myths that open debate destroys. Chernobyl disaster in April 1986 symbolizes the technological bankruptcy of a system that sacrifices safety for production targets, while demonstrating the global consequences of domestic failures in an interconnected world. The nuclear accident that contaminates vast areas provides Western opponents with evidence of incompetence, while forcing Moscow to accept international assistance that reveals the extent of their technological backwardness. Afghan casualties mount steadily as troops discover that superior firepower cannot defeat enemies who enjoy popular support and sanctuary across international borders. The body bags that return to cities throughout the USSR create domestic opposition to a conflict that produces no visible benefits while consuming resources needed for reconstruction. The Red Vietnam that Afghanistan becomes undermines military morale while strengthening arguments for withdrawal. Third world interventions that once seemed to demonstrate dynamism increasingly appear as financial burdens that drain resources without providing strategic benefits proportional to their costs. Cuban personnel in Angola, Vietnamese armies in Cambodia, and advisors throughout Africa represent commitments that require continued support, while offering diminishing returns on investments that Moscow can no longer afford. Oil price collapses during the mid-1980s devastate revenues that depend heavily on energy exports to earn hard currency needed for technology imports. The economic crisis that results from declining commodity prices compels painful choices between military spending and civilian consumption, while revealing the structural weaknesses of an economy that cannot compete in global markets. Military buildup under the administration compels Moscow into spending competitions that their command economy cannot sustain, while maintaining living standards that prevent popular unrest. The strategic choice between guns and butter that confronts all governments becomes particularly acute for leaders who must justify their rule through promises of eventual prosperity that seem increasingly unlikely to be fulfilled through existing methods. Religious revivals throughout Eastern Europe challenge atheistic ideologies, while providing organizational frameworks for opposition movements that governments cannot easily suppress, without alienating populations whose cooperation they require for economic productivity. The Catholic Church in Poland, Protestant churches in East Germany, and Orthodox communities throughout the region become sanctuaries for dissent that gradually erode official authority. Human rights movements that emerge throughout the Eastern Bloc exploit Helsinki Accords provisions to demand freedoms that governments cannot deny, without repudiating international agreements they have signed. Dissidents who invoke legal commitments compel authorities into defensive positions where repression appears to violate their own stated principles, while accommodation threatens to undermine essential controls. As 1985 concludes, the cold struggle has reached a turning point where economic realities compel reconsideration of policies that both superpowers pursued for 4 decades. The military competition that consumed vast resources has produced stalemate at ever higher levels of destructive capability, while failing to resolve fundamental conflicts that divide the world into opposing camps. Emergence of new leadership offers possibilities for transformation that neither side fully understands, his reform agenda containing potential for changes that could fundamentally alter the nature of international relations. Yet the energies he unleashes may prove impossible to control once released from the constraints that have maintained stability through fear and repression. The next phase will test whether the system possesses sufficient flexibility to adapt to changing conditions, or whether the pressures building within socialist societies will ultimately produce collapse that ends the cold confrontation through victory for one side, rather than accommodation between them. Spring arrives early in Moscow during 1985, carrying with it winds that will sweep away an empire built on fear and sustained by lies. In the corridors of the Kremlin, where Stalin once signed death warrants and Brezhnev dozed through Politburo meetings, a new kind of leader takes power with ideas that will prove more dangerous to the established order than any Western weapon. Mikhail Gorbachev assumes the office of General Secretary on March 11th, his youthful energy and reformist rhetoric masking the revolutionary changes he will unleash upon a system that cannot survive the medicine he prescribes for its salvation. The youngest man to lead the USSR since Lenin himself brings to the summit of power a mind shaped by economic crisis and generational change that previous leaders could neither comprehend nor address. Born into the devastation of collectivization and raised during the horrors of the Great Patriotic War, he represents the first generation of leadership that did not participate in Stalin's crimes yet inherited their consequences. His rise to supreme authority marks the moment when the Red Empire begins its final transformation from world power to historical memory. Early meetings with Western leaders reveal a politician whose intellectual curiosity and personal charm stand in stark contrast to the wooden bureaucrats who preceded him in the Kremlin hierarchy. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher emerges from their initial encounter declaring that this is a man we can do business with, her assessment reflecting recognition that ideology might finally yield to pragmatism in superpower relations. Yet neither the Iron Lady nor the reformist General Secretary fully grasps the forces that their collaboration will unleash. Economic realities that drive modernization initiatives reflect the systematic failure of central planning to adapt to technological revolutions, transforming global commerce and industry. Computer networks that revolutionize Western productivity remain beyond the capabilities of a command economy designed for mass production of steel and grain, rather than the sophisticated electronics and software that define modern competitiveness. Factories produce television sets that explode and automobiles that require years of waiting lists, their quality so poor that citizens prefer black market Western goods despite legal penalties. Perestroika emerges as the new leader's answer to economic stagnation, its promises of restructuring appealing to populations desperate for improvements in living standards that have declined relative to Western prosperity for 2 decades. The restructuring program that begins with modest adjustments to planning mechanisms gradually expands into wholesale revision of socialist principles, as each partial measure reveals deeper problems requiring more radical solutions. What starts as economic tinkering evolves into systematic dismantling of the foundations upon which authoritarian rule rests. Private enterprise permitted under perestroika creates contradictions that expose the theoretical bankruptcy of Marxist economics, while demonstrating the superiority of market mechanisms that party ideology had condemned as exploitative and inefficient. Cooperative businesses that emerge to fill gaps in state distribution systems quickly outperform government enterprises in both quality and customer service. their success providing daily proof that socialist theories bear no relation to economic reality. Agricultural liberalization that allows peasants to sell surplus production on free markets produces immediate improvements in food availability, while undermining collective farming systems that absorbed enormous subsidies while failing to feed the population adequately. Small plots that farmers cultivate for personal use yield far more per acre than the vast state farms that symbolize red achievement, their productivity revealing the waste inherent in systems that eliminate individual incentives. Glasnost policies that accompany economic restructuring unleash forces for intellectual and political freedom that prove impossible to contain within limits that preserve party control. The transparency that begins with modest criticism of bureaucratic inefficiency gradually expands into fundamental questioning of historical myths and contemporary policies that had been beyond discussion for 7 decades. Citizens discover through officially sanctioned revelations that their government has systematically lied about everything, from agricultural statistics to the scope of Stalin's crimes. Historical truths that emerge through glasnost shatter the carefully constructed mythology that legitimized Red Rule while revealing the massive scale of suffering inflicted upon the peoples by their own government. The acknowledgement that Stalin murdered millions of innocent citizens destroys claims about socialist humanitarianism, while raising uncomfortable questions about the complicity of surviving leaders in crimes they now condemn. Archives that open to researchers expose the gap between propaganda and reality that had been hidden behind walls of censorship and fear. Media freedoms that expand under glasnost create space for criticism that quickly exceeds anything the leadership intended to permit, as journalists and writers test the boundaries of acceptable discourse, while audiences hunger for information that official sources had withheld. Television programs that begin by exposing local corruption gradually examine national policies and historical events that reveal systematic failures at every level of government. The press that was once the servant of power becomes its most dangerous enemy. Nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in April 1986 provides a devastating example of how secretive governance and technological incompetence combine to threaten not merely citizens, but populations throughout Europe who suffer contamination from radioactive fallout. Initial attempts to conceal the scope of the catastrophe collapse when foreign monitoring stations detect radiation levels that prove the official minimization of the accident to be criminally dishonest. The reactor that explodes takes with it the last remnants of public trust in government competence and honesty. International response to Chernobyl demonstrates the global interconnection that makes isolated national development impossible in an age when pollution and information cross borders regardless of political barriers. Western assistance that flows to contaminated regions provides evidence of humanitarian cooperation that transcends ideological divisions while revealing the technological backwardness that makes such disasters inevitable. Under systems that prioritize political control over scientific objectivity, arms control negotiations between Washington and Moscow accelerate as both leaders recognize their mutual interest in reducing military expenditures that drain resources needed for domestic reconstruction and economic modernization. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in December 1987, eliminates entire categories of weapons while establishing verification procedures that require unprecedented openness about military capabilities and deployment patterns. Reagan and the General Secretary develop personal chemistry that enables breakthrough agreements despite decades of mutual suspicion and ideological hostility between their nations. Their summit meetings in Geneva, Reykjavik, Washington, and Moscow create momentum for cooperation that extends beyond arms control to to include economic and cultural exchanges that begin normalizing relations between peoples who had been taught to consider each other mortal enemies. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, announced in 1988, represents the first clear admission of military defeat in the nation's history. Its acknowledgement that superior firepower cannot overcome determined resistance when applied to conflicts that lack clear political objectives or popular support. The retreat that begins in May 1988 and concludes in February 1989 removes the last troops from a country they failed to pacify, despite deploying 115,000 soldiers and employing tactics that devastated the civilian population. Afghan conflict's conclusion eliminates the primary source of tension in superpower relations, while providing the United States with a model for supporting insurgencies that could be applied to other regions where Moscow maintains client regimes. The success of Mujahideen resistance demonstrates that even superpowers can be defeated by combinations of local knowledge, foreign assistance, and religious motivation that conventional military doctrine fails to address adequately. Eastern European satellites begin testing the limits of Moscow's tolerance for change as their populations observe glasnost and perestroika, creating opportunities for transformation that had been unimaginable during previous decades. The Sinatra Doctrine that replaces the Brezhnev Doctrine signals that satellite states will be permitted to choose their own paths without fear of military intervention, though few believe initially that this promise extends to abandoning socialist rule entirely. Polish negotiations between government and solidarity create the first legal opposition movement in Eastern Europe since the consolidation of Red Power after World War II. Roundtable talks that begin in February 1989 acknowledge the bankruptcy of imposed rule, while establishing procedures for transition to democratic governance that could provide models for peaceful change throughout the region. Hungarian liberalization proceeds even more rapidly as the government that once crushed revolution in 1956 now leads the movement for democratization that dismantles the apparatus of authoritarian control. The removal of fortifications along the Austrian border in May 1989 creates the first gap in the Iron Curtain that has divided Europe for 4 decades, its opening providing escape routes for East Germans who begin fleeing their country in unprecedented numbers. East German refugees who crowd into Hungarian and Czechoslovak embassies seeking asylum create a humanitarian crisis that forces governments throughout the region to choose between maintaining border controls and respecting human rights commitments they have signed. The exodus that gains momentum throughout the summer reveals the complete collapse of legitimacy for a regime that must imprison its own population to prevent their escape to freedom. Demonstrations that begin in Leipzig spread throughout East Germany as citizens who had been terrorized into silence for 40 years suddenly discover their collective power to demand change. Monday prayers at Nikolaikirche that evolve into massive street protests demonstrate how religious faith can provide organizational frameworks for opposition movements that secular authorities cannot easily suppress without creating martyrs and inspiring further resistance. Berlin Wall that symbolized the Cold War's division of Europe becomes the focal point for popular demonstrations, demanding freedom of movement and democratic governance. Fortifications that once seemed permanent fixtures of the international landscape suddenly appear vulnerable to crowds armed with nothing more dangerous than hammers, chisels, and an unshakable determination to rejoin the human family from which they had been forcibly separated. November 9th, 1989. Witnesses the collapse of the most visible symbol of red oppression as East German authorities, overwhelmed by popular pressure and abandoned by their protectors, open the checkpoints that had separated families for 28 years. Spontaneous celebration that erupts at the Brandenburg Gate as citizens pour through barriers that had claimed hundreds of lives, marks the moment when the Cold War effectively ends, though formal treaties will require 2 more years to complete. Peaceful revolutions that sweep across Eastern Europe during the autumn of 1989 demonstrate how quickly authoritarian systems can collapse when they lose the will to use force against their own populations. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, led by playwright Václav Havel, shows how intellectual courage and moral authority can triumph over tanks and secret police when supported by populations that refuse to be intimidated by threats of violence. Romanian Revolution provides the only violent exception to the pattern of peaceful transformation, as Nicolae Ceausescu's regime attempts to suppress demonstrations through methods that had succeeded in maintaining his dictatorship for 2 decades. Brutality that characterizes his government's final days contrasts sharply with the restraint shown by other leaders who recognize that their time has passed and gracefully yield power to democratic movements. Moscow's response to these revolutionary developments reflects recognition that military intervention would destroy the international cooperation needed to address domestic economic crisis, while potentially triggering conflicts that could escalate into nuclear confrontation. The decision to permit satellite states to choose their own destinies represents the most important strategic reversal in modern history, effectively ending the Cold War through unilateral concessions that previous Western leaders could never have imagined possible. Internal pressures within the USSR itself accelerate as minority nationalities observe the successful independence movements in Eastern Europe, while questioning why they should remain subordinate to Moscow when Poles and Hungarians have achieved sovereignty. Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania begin demanding restoration of the independence they lost during World War II. Their movements inspiring similar aspirations throughout the multinational empire. Economic collapse that accompanies political liberalization creates shortages of basic necessities that make daily life increasingly difficult for ordinary citizens who had expected change to improve, rather than worsen their living conditions. Empty store shelves and endless queues that characterize commerce during the late 1980s provide daily reminders that the system cannot deliver the prosperity it has promised for 7 decades. Popular unrest that erupts in various republics reflects not merely economic hardship, but fundamental rejection of Russian domination that had been disguised as socialist internationalism. Ethnic conflicts that explode in the Caucasus and Central Asia reveal the artificial nature of unity, while demonstrating how quickly imperial structures can disintegrate when central authority weakens and local grievances find political expression. Conservative opposition to modernization efforts organizes within party and military hierarchies, as officials recognize that continued liberalization threatens not merely their privileges, but the entire system that gave meaning to their lives and careers. Resistance that emerges from bureaucratic and security apparatus reflects genuine fears that democratization will produce chaos rather than renewal, their concerns proving prophetic as events spiral beyond anyone's control. International recognition of the transformations sweeping the Red World comes through awards and agreements that acknowledge the historical significance of developments few observers had predicted. The Nobel Peace Prize, awarded to the reformist leader in 1990, symbolizes global appreciation for leadership that chose change over repression, while the various arms control treaties signed during this period formally codified the end of military competition that had consumed vast resources for 4 decades. As 1989 concludes, the world that emerged from World War II has been fundamentally transformed through developments that seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. The Berlin Wall lies in ruins. Eastern Europe has achieved freedom, and the USSR itself faces pressures that threaten its continued existence as a unified state. The Cold War that began with Churchill's warning about an Iron Curtain ends with the joyous sounds of hammers breaking down barriers that had divided humanity for nearly half a century. Yet celebration that greets these developments masks uncertainties about what will replace the stable, if dangerous, equilibrium that had governed international relations since 1945. The bipolar world that provided predictable patterns of alliance and opposition gives way to a more complex reality, where old certainties no longer apply, and new challenges await leaders who must navigate without the familiar landmarks that had guided policy for 2 generations. As the cold morning light spreads across Berlin in 1990, the city wakes to the final days of its division, with cranes and bulldozers chipping away at the wall that had once cleaved the world in 2, where machine gun nests and minefields separated families for 28 years. Vendors now sell pieces of the wall to tourists, while East and West German officials negotiate the terms of reunification that will heal wounds carved into the heart of Europe. The concrete slabs that fall beneath sledgehammers carry with them the dreams of empire that stretched from the Elbe to the Pacific, their destruction marking the beginning of the end for the last great colonial power of the modern age. Chancellor Helmut Kohl seizes the moment of German destiny with the determination of a leader who understands that historical opportunities must be grasped before they slip away forever. The massive politician, whose bulk conceals a subtle mind, works tirelessly to convince skeptical allies that German reunification serves Western interests, while offering Moscow economic incentives that make peaceful withdrawal more attractive than military resistance. His vision of a unified Germany, anchored firmly in NATO and the European community, provides the framework for ending Europe's division without triggering the continental conflict that previous generations feared would accompany any change to post-war boundaries. President George Bush navigates the delicate diplomacy of German reunification with the caution of a former intelligence chief who understands how quickly international crises can spiral beyond control. His administration's support for Kohl's initiatives demonstrates American recognition that the division of Germany has outlived its usefulness, while creating new challenges that require careful management to prevent destabilizing consequences. The president who inherited the Cold War's conclusion must ensure that victory does not produce chaos. Mikhail Gorbachev faces the impossible choice between preserving his multinational state and maintaining his reforms, each option requiring sacrifices that threaten to destroy everything he has worked to achieve. The reformist leader who unleashed forces of change discovers that democratization and central control cannot coexist when subject peoples demand the same freedoms that Glasnost promised to Russians. His reluctant acceptance of German reunification reflects recognition that military intervention would destroy both his domestic legitimacy and international standing, while solving none of the fundamental problems that drive the crisis. Economic crisis that accompanies political transformation creates hardships that test the patience of populations who expected reform to bring immediate improvements in living standards. Store shelves that remain empty despite promises of market mechanisms convince many citizens that change has worsened rather than improved their daily lives, their disillusionment providing ammunition for conservative forces that blame liberalization for problems that actually result from decades of central planning. The gap between expectation and reality threatens to destroy public support for democratization before it can take root. Currency union between East and West Germany in July 1990 demonstrates the economic realities that drive political reunification, while creating precedents for peaceful integration that other divided nations might emulate. The Deutsche Mark that replaces the worthless East German currency provides instant prosperity for populations who had endured shortages and rationing for 4 decades. Their sudden access to Western goods and services, creating loyalty to democracy that no amount of propaganda could achieve. Military withdrawals from Eastern Europe proceed with surprising efficiency, as commanders who once planned for offensive operations against NATO now organize the largest peacetime redeployment in military history. The 380,000 soldiers who return from Germany carry with them the weapons and equipment of armies that will never again threaten Western Europe, their departure symbolizing the end of threats that had justified massive defense expenditures for 2 generations. 2+4 negotiations that formalize German reunification bring together the victorious powers of World War II for the final settlement of conflicts that began with Hitler's aggression in 1939. Agreements signed in Moscow on September 12, 1990, formally end the occupation regimes that have governed Germany for 45 years, while establishing sovereignty that enables the German people to determine their own destiny for the first time since the Weimar Republic's collapse. Baltic independence movements accelerate as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declare their intention to restore the sovereignty that Stalin destroyed through the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Peaceful resistance that emerges in these small territories draws strength from successful liberation movements in Eastern Europe, while testing Moscow's willingness to use force against peoples who never voluntarily joined the USSR. Their courage in facing down central authority inspires similar movements throughout the multinational federation. Lithuanian Declaration of Independence on March 11, 1990, triggers the first direct confrontation between the reformist leader and the independence movements that threatened to tear apart his country. The man who permitted satellite states to choose their own destinies now faces demands for self-determination from constituent parts that form integral components of the homeland itself. His decision to impose economic blockades rather than military occupation reflects both his commitment to avoiding violence and his recognition that brutal suppression would destroy his international reputation. Boris Yeltsin emerges as the most dangerous challenger to central authority. His election as president of the Russian Federation, providing him with a democratic mandate that surpasses anything his rival can claim. The former party boss, who reinvented himself as a populist Democrat, understands that Russian nationalism offers a more powerful mobilizing force than communist ideology, in an age when Marxist promises have lost their credibility. His rivalry with the General Secretary transforms personal animosity into institutional conflict that threatens the state's very existence. Constitutional crisis that develops between Moscow and the constituent territories reflects fundamental contradictions between centralized structure and democratic governance that no amount of constitutional engineering can resolve. The center that attempts to maintain control over regions whose populations demand independence faces the impossible task of satisfying both unity and autonomy simultaneously. Each compromise that grants additional powers to local governments weakens central authority while failing to satisfy demands for complete sovereignty. Economic collapse accelerates as the command system disintegrates without being replaced by functioning market mechanisms that could coordinate production and distribution. Industrial enterprises that depended upon central planning for raw materials and markets find themselves unable to operate when bureaucratic controls disappear, while price mechanisms remain underdeveloped. The resulting chaos produces shortages of basic goods that convince many citizens that reform has brought disaster rather than progress. Coup attempt of August 19, 1991, represents the last desperate gamble by hardliners who believe that force can restore the authority that political compromise has frittered away. Conspirators who place the General Secretary under house arrest while declaring national emergency, fail to understand that the society they seek to control has been fundamentally transformed by 6 years of liberalization that cannot be reversed through proclamations and troop deployments. Emergency Committee that proclaims itself the savior of the federal state reveals through its very composition the bankruptcy of ideas that once commanded global respect. Grey bureaucrats who announce their seizure of power offer nothing more inspiring than a return to policies that had already failed spectacularly, their leadership consisting of figures whose careers peaked during the stagnation they now promise to restore. Their inability to articulate compelling visions for the future dooms their enterprise before it truly begins. Yeltsin's defiance from atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building provides the dramatic symbol of resistance that transforms a bureaucratic coup into a popular uprising against authoritarian rule. The Russian president who climbs onto armored vehicles to address crowds demonstrates the personal courage that democratic leadership requires when confronted by force. His willingness to risk everything for constitutional governance inspiring citizens who had learned to fear state power. Military commanders who refuse to obey orders to storm government buildings reveal the extent to which democratization has penetrated even institutions that traditionally served as pillars of authoritarian control. Paratroop officers who decline to fire on civilians demonstrate that professional soldiers can distinguish between legitimate commands and criminal orders. Their restraint preventing bloodshed that might have triggered civil war throughout the crumbling federation. Popular resistance that emerges spontaneously throughout Moscow and Leningrad shows how quickly authoritarian systems lose legitimacy when they abandon the consent of the governed for naked force. Crowds that erect barricades around democratic institutions while facing down tanks and armored personnel carriers prove that ordinary citizens can defeat professional armies when they fight for principles rather than territory. Their courage in confronting overwhelming force demonstrates the power of moral authority over military might. Coups' collapse after 3 days reflects both the plotters' incompetence and the fundamental changes that glasnost and perestroika have wrought in society. Conspirators who expected populations to accept their authority as previous generations had done discover that democratization has created expectations of participation that cannot be satisfied through diktat. Their failure destroys the last vestiges of communist legitimacy while accelerating the centrifugal forces that tear the Union apart. Return to Moscow reveals how completely the failed coup has altered power relationships within the dying state. The reformist leader who departed as head of a superpower returns to find his authority evaporated and his institutions delegitimized by their association with the attempted putsch. His pathetic attempts to restore central control meet resistance from regional leaders who recognize that the moment for independence has arrived and must be seized before it passes. Declarations of independence follow one another, like dominoes falling in predetermined sequence as local leaders understand that delay might allow restoration of central control that would eliminate opportunities for sovereignty. Ukraine's declaration on August 24, 1991, removes any possibility that the USSR can survive in recognizable form, its departure depriving Moscow of the economic resources and population needed to maintain great power status. Administrative response to the coup and its aftermath demonstrates American recognition that stability requires supporting democratic forces even when their victory produces uncertainty about future relationships. The president who cultivated personal relationships with one leader now transfers support to another while working to ensure that nuclear weapons remain under responsible control during the transition. His management of this delicate period prevents the chaos that might have accompanied multinational collapse. Economic agreements that begin to replace central planning with market relationships create new forms of cooperation between former constituent parts that had been artificially unified under communist rule. The Commonwealth of Independent States that emerges from the wreckage attempts to preserve beneficial connections while eliminating the central domination that had poisoned relationships between peoples who share common interests despite different national identities. Nuclear weapons disposal becomes the most pressing practical concern as the world's largest arsenal finds itself scattered across multiple sovereignties whose long-term intentions remain uncertain. Negotiations that concentrate strategic weapons in Russian hands while providing security guarantees for non-nuclear territories establish precedents for peaceful management of federal dissolution that future generations might emulate when other multinational states face similar challenges. International recognition of new states proceeds cautiously as world leaders balance support for self-determination against concerns about precedents that might encourage separatist movements in their own countries. The diplomatic revolution that transforms former constituent parts into sovereign nations creates opportunities for bilateral relationships unmediated by central controls, while raising questions about alliance structures designed for bipolar competition. December 25th, 1991, witnesses the end of an era as the reformist leader resigns his position as president of a state that no longer exists. Television address that announces his departure from office provides the final chapter in a story that began with revolutionary dreams of human liberation and concludes with recognition that those dreams had become nightmares for the peoples forced to live them. His resignation letter, delivered to an office that now controls only the building in which it sits, marks the formal end of the world's last colonial power. Flag that descends from the Kremlin for the final time carries with it the hopes and fears of 7 decades that promised paradise but delivered tyranny. The red banner that flew over victories against fascism and achievements in space now represents only historical memory, as the Russian tricolor takes its place above institutions that must discover new purposes for existence. The symbolic changing of flags marks the end of ideological competition that had divided the world into hostile camps. American response to the multinational states' dissolution combines relief at the end of nuclear confrontation with concern about regional instability that might result from federal collapse. The superpower that emerges victorious from the Cold War faces the challenge of constructing new international relationships without the familiar landmarks that bipolar competition provided for strategic planning. Victory brings responsibilities that may prove more complex than the burdens of confrontation. Russian Federation that inherits the nuclear arsenal and United Nations Security Council seat represents both continuity and change in relationships that had been frozen for nearly half a century. Yeltsin's Russia offers possibilities for cooperation that Stalin's regime could never provide, while creating uncertainties about intentions and capabilities that will require years to resolve through practical experience. Global transformation that accompanies the Cold War's end extends far beyond the immediate participants to encompass every nation whose policies had been shaped by bipolar competition. Developing countries that played superpowers against each other for aid and protection must now navigate a world where different rules apply to international relations. The end of ideological competition creates space for other forms of conflict, while eliminating some sources of tension that had threatened global peace. Economic integration that becomes possible with ideological barriers removed offers opportunities for prosperity that had been impossible during the Cold War's division of the world into hostile camps. Market mechanisms that triumph over central planning create possibilities for cooperation that transcend national boundaries while challenging traditional concepts of sovereignty that assumed economic autarky was both possible and desirable. As 1991 concludes, humanity stands at a watershed moment between the certainties of bipolar confrontation and the uncertainties of whatever international system will emerge from the wreckage of the old order. The Cold War that began with disputes over Eastern Europe's future ends with the peaceful dissolution of the multinational state that had dominated half the continent for nearly 50 years. The silence that replaces the rhetoric of ideological competition creates space for new forms of cooperation, while eliminating the predictable patterns that had governed international relations since World War II's end. Still, the celebration of victory can't hide the challenges ahead, for leaders now tasked with building new institutions and alliances without the structure once offered by bipolar rivalry. The world that emerges from the Cold War's conclusion offers both unprecedented opportunities for human cooperation and novel dangers that require wisdom and restraint to navigate successfully. The end of one historical era marks the beginning of another, whose character remains to be determined by choices that leaders and peoples have yet to make.